So a lot depends on the host country. It's anecdotal, so I'm not generalizing, but my wife's parents, who are Pakistani, born in Pakistan, would say things that they find British Pakistani, so those born in the UK, called arrogant and flashy. And when they travel to Spain and found them, they're really humble and hospitable and so on. So the topic of today's video is, are Muslims a diaspora or not? We are talking about social sciences, so there's many different and sometimes conflicting definitions. What is a diaspora? What is not? Where do you start? Where do you put the threshold? And so on and so on. And from what perspective do you look at the term, so it doesn't make things easier? Hello and welcome. My name is William. I am a researcher in sociology at the University of Warwick in the UK, and this is a video series around my latest book, Muslims in the Neoliberal Empire. Think about it. A diaspora is a group of people who live elsewhere than in the place they were born or their parents, their ancestors were born. It usually connotes large movements of population. It is something like everything in the social sciences, which is multidimensional, complex, and constantly evolving. It's not fixed. Definitions constantly evolve. Because you can be part of multiple diasporas at the same time. For example, my parents are Polish. I am biologically Polish, so I am part of the Polish diaspora. But then I was born and I grew up in France, and I spent 26 years of my life in France, which means that now I've moved to the UK. I'm also part of the French diaspora. If you've ever watched something called Club Dorothée, well, that tells you all. Don't laugh, I'm not proud of it. But the question is, if you want to write about Muslims as a diaspora, is can faith be a common factor strong enough to define people as being part of a diaspora? So you've probably heard this term when it comes to the Jewish diaspora, because this is actually where the term comes from. Can people be part of a diaspora just because of their faith? We don't very often talk about the Christian diaspora, even though they are all around the globe. But then there is further debates because, some people argue that being Jewish is just about being part of the religion. Some others argue it's just an ethnicity. Some argue it's both. So we may tweak the question, what do people mean when they say or they talk about the Muslim diaspora? When people talk about a Muslim diaspora, they refer to this involuntary migration back to the centers of power. They didn't want to move, and actually lots of people, whether it was North and West Africans in France and South Asians in the UK, had this idea of at some point going back to their home countries. But social and economic realities made that things turn out differently. I've read into all the literature around diasporas, and specifically because this is, again, my research is very UK specific, read into South Asian diasporas, because this is the main Muslim diaspora, I would say, here in the UK. It's usually defined from the cultural perspective as people who share vernacular tastes in cuisines, music, sport, poetry, fashion, film, but they can also diverge in different contexts, such as religion, because obviously when it comes to the South Asian diaspora, you've got people who are Hindu, Sikh, Christian, and Muslims. And when it comes to Islam, it adds a layer of complexity because, as you know, just like Christianity, this is an identity which encompasses many different cultures. So the usual starting point of the conversation around diasporas is a geographic homeland, defined like tangible space, like a country or part of the planet Earth, where people or their ancestors originate from. But in the case of Muslims, they do not share a common homeland. However, as community historian Yahya Birt points out, they share a common orientation, a qibla if you like, which is, I would say, a symbolic orientation towards, tangible orientation towards Makkah. Every time people pray, it's towards Makkah. But again, a shared faith, shared beliefs, shared scriptures, shared prophets, and so on and so on. And for some people, a sense of belonging to a wider worldwide community, the Ummah. So Salman Said and Peter Mandeville call this a transnational Islamic homeland. So it's not a homeland defined by geographic borders, but defined by people. You're basically kind of home wherever you meet other Muslims. It is this idea that you will find a community that will support you wherever you are on earth. But is it true though? So I'll be exploring this topic of transnational, transcultural solidarity within the Ummah in future videos. But if you want to talk in terms of social, cultural or spiritual capital, so they share, some researchers argue that they share a common spiritual capital in the form of meanings, values, purpose, what's your purpose in life, what's your vision of society, of the world, what's your role on earth, and motivations. And although everyone I've interviewed identify as being part of the Muslim diaspora, there's always tensions. Because it's not because people share the same faith as you that they will consider you part of their community. It's like, do I recognize you as a Muslim? Yes, but can you marry my daughter, or can I hire you in my company? Maybe not. Because again, when we talk about diaspora, this is not monolithic. There is layers and layers and layers of complexities within a diasporic community. It's also important to say that a given diaspora doesn't hold onto their heritage everywhere in the same way. Akala, the writer, poet and community organizer, observes that Jamaicans in the UK are much more clinging into Jamaican culture than Jamaicans in Jamaica. The reason why, he says, it's because Jamaicans in Jamaica don't feel the need to prove themselves, as opposed to British Jamaicans. Those who have studied the South Asian diasporas, whether it is in Europe, America, or indentured countries, notice that they find diasporic culture as a site of melancholia, or like Jacques Derrida would say, a site of impossible mourning. What does it mean? So migration has produced a collective and transgenerational trauma. So it doesn't mean it's transmitted through genetics. It can be passed on through social norms, psychology, parenting, it's lots of different things. So a transgenerational trauma of loss, and diasporic communities are faced with the inability to make up for it, which means they try to cling on to a time, a space, and cultural elements which they cannot access anymore, and for some of them have never accessed, because if, let's say, you're Pakistani, you're born in the UK, and you've never traveled to Pakistan, you can't have access to the culture of your parents and your ancestors. So they've observed that it leads in people to a sense of impoverished self. You feel that there's something missing. So people compensate by latching on elements of the culture, so music, food, clothing, and sometimes it goes, people overcompensate. So what happens is that they create a romanticized idea of, let's say, for example, what does it mean to be South Asian? What does it mean to be Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi? But because they don't have a direct access to the culture, they take inspiration from the popular culture, what you see in the movies, Bollywood movies, Pakistani drama. For example, people wearing sherwanis for Jummah, while this is an element of clothing which is traditionally used for weddings only. But beyond culture, when it comes to Muslims, you also have this sense of nostalgia when it comes to, let's say, the golden age of Islam, 12th century Andalusia, or the very early beginnings of the revelation. Although Muslims do not share a geographic homeland, they share these common values, scriptures, beliefs, references. And this is what Edward Said calls points of origin. So it's not geographic points of origin, but it can be, symbolic, it can be cultural, it can be abstract. So Muslims have two symbolic homes, Makkah and Medina, that's the obvious. But also some, can choose to, as their point of origin, some of the Islamicate empires of the past. And that's a very interesting definition, because this is, the feeling of if you go to a foreign country and you enter a mosque and you just find a very similar display, architecture, all the shelves with the books, the way people pray. If it's something you've grown up in, or you got attached to, This is something that feels familiar. This is something that feels homely. And I think this is what Edward Said tried to convey when he talks about these symbolic points of origin. The topic of the next video would be actually about people losing this attachment to their ancestral culture. We're going to talk about de-diasporization, westernization, like how do you make the difference. We'll talk about coconuts, Oreos, not the biscuits or the fruits, obviously. And if you want to hear more about this book journey, if you want to access the content, please subscribe to my newsletter. I'll be also programming a few online live discussions, so feel free to join. Just keep an eye on the links I'll be sending out. I hope it was useful, and as always, take care of yourselves and each other. Many of you don't know, but it is possible to find 800 milliliters mugs on the internet. The problem is I finish my drinks in one go. That's not very camera friendly either.